At an airport gate, a first-class passenger was loudly accused of carrying a fake boarding pass. The gate agent smirked, convinced she had caught someone trying to cheat the system. But what she didn't know? The woman she was humiliating wasn't just any traveler. She was someone with the power to shake the entire airline. How will she respond to this public humiliation? Will she choose to fight back or walk away? And what happens when the truth about her identity is finally revealed? Stay tuned for the full story. And don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with energy. The overhead announcements blended with the chatter of travelers rushing through security, families reuniting, and business people typing furiously on their laptops. Among them, Vanessa Carter walked toward Gate 32, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floors. She adjusted the strap of her leather carry-on, her posture upright and confident. She was no ordinary passenger. She was a former Air Force pilot, and now a leading aerospace engineer working on next-generation aircraft. But today, she was just another traveler, eager to board her first-class flight to New York City for an important industry event. As she approached the boarding area, she noticed the usual divide, passengers in economy lining up, while those in first class stood in a separate queue. A well-dressed white man ahead of her smiled at the gate agent and handed over his boarding pass. She barely glanced at it before waving him through. Vanessa stepped forward and handed over her first-class ticket with a polite nod. "Good afternoon," she said smoothly. The gate agent, Linda Kessler, took one look at Vanessa and immediately hesitated. Her eyes flickered with something Vanessa had seen before: doubt. Linda barely acknowledged the greeting as she took the boarding pass. Her brow furrowed. She flipped the ticket over, as if expecting to find something suspicious. "This doesn't look right," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, maintaining her composure. "It's a first-class ticket. You can check the system," she said evenly. Linda didn't move toward her computer. Instead, she crossed her arms, her lips curling into a slight smirk. "We get a lot of these. People trying to sneak into first class when they don't belong." Vanessa felt the weight of judgment settle over her like an unwelcome cloud. Vanessa Carter stood at the gate, her first-class ticket still in Linda Kessler's grip. Around her, the steady hum of passengers shuffling in line turned into murmurs. She could feel their eyes on her, some indifferent, others openly curious. "I'm sorry. What exactly seems to be the problem?" Vanessa asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. Linda exhaled sharply, still turning the boarding pass in her fingers. "It just doesn't look right. First-class seats are expensive. You sure this ticket is yours?" Vanessa narrowed her eyes. "You could check the system instead of making assumptions." Linda's lips pressed together in a tight line. "I'll need to verify it," she said. But instead of scanning the ticket, she stepped away from her podium and reached for her walkie-talkie. Vanessa took a slow breath. "Here we go." Behind her, the line of passengers grew restless. A middle-aged white businessman, the one who had been allowed through without issue, frowned at the scene. A young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Excuse me," a voice piped up. An older black woman, standing in the economy line, shook her head. "She gave you her ticket. Why aren't you checking it like you did for the others?" Linda ignored the question and clicked her walkie-talkie. "Security, I need assistance at Gate 32. Possible boarding pass fraud." The words hit Vanessa like a slap. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her carry-on. "Fraud?" "Excuse me," Vanessa said, her tone now edged with incredulity. Are you accusing me of trying to sneak into first class? Linda folded her arms. Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. We have to make sure passengers are in the correct class. You didn't double-check anyone else's ticket, Vanessa shot back. You let that man through without even scanning his pass. Linda's expression hardened, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Miss, are you holding up the line? It was the businessman who had passed without issue. He glanced between Linda and Vanessa, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the situation. Looks like it, Linda muttered. Vanessa exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to remain composed. Years in the military had taught her how to keep her temper in check. This wasn't the time for an outburst. You're making a mistake, she said. I paid for this ticket. I have the receipt in my email. If you check your system, Linda held up a hand. Ma'am, I'll have security handle this. Just then, two security officers approached. One of them, Officer Craig Mitchell, a tall man with a buzz cut and an authoritative stance. Problem here? Mitchell asked, glancing between Linda and Vanessa. Linda nodded. This passenger is trying to board with a suspicious first-class ticket. I need verification before she proceeds. Mitchell turned his eyes to Vanessa, appraising her. Ma'am, can I see your ID? Vanessa held her head high as she reached into her bag. She had done nothing wrong, but as she handed over her identification, a bitter taste formed in her mouth, because she knew exactly why she was being questioned. Vanessa Carter handed her ID to Officer Craig Mitchell, her movements controlled and deliberate. She refused to let them see how much this moment infuriated her. Mitchell examined the ID, then took the boarding pass from Linda. He pulled a small device from his belt and scanned it. A few tense seconds passed as the machine processed the ticket. Beep. The screen flashed valid in bold letters. Mitchell frowned slightly and looked at Vanessa's ID again, then back at Linda. It checks out. Her ticket is legitimate. Linda's lips tightened. Well, I still think it's suspicious, she muttered, folding her arms. You don't see many people like her in first class. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Several passengers sucked in their breath. A white woman in the economy line audibly gasped. Vanessa felt the familiar heat of anger rise in her chest, but she controlled it. Years of dealing with subtle and not so subtle discrimination had trained her for this moment. She looked directly at Linda. People like me? She repeated, her voice dangerously calm. Linda hesitated but didn't back down. You know what I mean. First class isn't exactly what? Vanessa cut in. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, now realizing the full gravity of the situation. Miss Carter, I apologize for the misunderstanding. There's no reason you can't board. But Vanessa wasn't going to let this slide so easily. She turned to Linda, who now looked slightly uneasy, but still unwilling to admit fault. You assumed I didn't belong here before you even checked the system. You called security on me without cause. Now, even after verifying my ticket, you're still implying that I don't belong in first class. Vanessa's voice was steady, but edged with controlled fury. That's not just unprofessional. It's discriminatory. A murmur spread through the crowd. A young black man near the back of the line shook his head in disgust. This is why we can't just exist without being questioned, he muttered. Linda opened her mouth, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Vanessa Carter? Everyone turned. A tall, authoritative man in a navy blue suit stepped forward. His silver hair and commanding presence made him instantly recognizable to Vanessa. It was Colonel James Redding, retired Air Force commander. Why the hell is one of my best pilots being harassed at a boarding gate? He demanded, his sharp gaze locking onto Linda. The tension in the air thickened as Colonel James Redding stepped forward, his piercing gaze sweeping across the scene. The crowd grew silent, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "Vanessa Carter?" he repeated, looking directly at her. Vanessa turned to him, her jaw tight, but her expression controlled. "Colonel Redding," she acknowledged, giving him a curt nod. The retired Air Force commander's expression hardened as he glanced between her and Officer Mitchell. "Would someone like to explain why one of the best pilots I've ever worked with is being held up at a boarding gate?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Passengers who had remained silent suddenly looked at Vanessa with a mix of curiosity and realization. Linda Kessler blinked, clearly thrown off. I was just verifying her ticket, sir," she stammered. "We get a lot of people trying to what?" Redding cut in, his voice sharp. "Because I just watched you wave two other passengers through without a second glance." But Vanessa Carter, a former Air Force pilot and current aerospace engineer, suddenly warrants a security call. Linda's face paled. I didn't know who she was," she stuttered. "You shouldn't have needed to," Vanessa said, folding her arms. "I handed you a valid ticket. That should have been enough." Colonel Redding shook his head in disappointment. "Ms. Kessler, do you realize the irony of this situation? The aircraft technology that keeps Pacific Sky Airlines flying, the very advancements you take for granted, have Vanessa Carter's fingerprints all over them." A hushed silence settled over the gate area. Linda looked like she wanted to disappear. Marcus Reynolds, the airline's on-duty manager, suddenly appeared, likely having heard about the commotion. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously between Redding, Vanessa, and Linda. Vanessa exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "Oh, there's a problem, all right." She turned to Marcus, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "And it's bigger than just me. It's about how people like me are treated in situations like this." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Carter, I assure you we take these matters very seriously." "Good," Vanessa interrupted, "because we're going to talk about it." Reynolds hesitated, realizing he had no easy way out of this. Colonel Redding smirked. "I'd suggest you listen to her, son. You might just save your airline from a serious PR disaster." Marcus Reynolds swallowed hard, glancing around at the growing audience. This was no longer just a boarding issue. It was turning into a public spectacle. "Ms. Carter," he started carefully, "I understand that this was an unfortunate misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Vanessa cut in, her voice even but sharp. "I was publicly accused of fraud, humiliated in front of dozens of passengers, and detained by security, all while holding a valid first-class ticket." Linda Kessler's face burned red, but she still refused to admit fault. "I was just following procedure," she muttered. Colonel Redding let out a humorless laugh. "Procedure? Funny, I didn't see you following procedure. With the other passengers, just her." Officer Mitchell, standing nearby, cleared his throat. "Look, I just responded to the call. But in hindsight, yeah, this wasn't handled right." Vanessa turned to him. "You had the chance to shut this down the second you saw my ID and verified my ticket. Instead, you hesitated. Why?" Mitchell opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no good answer. Marcus took a deep breath. "Miss Carter, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened today. Rest assured, Linda Kessler will be placed on immediate suspension, pending review." Linda gasped. "Wait, what?" You brought unnecessary security into this situation, and your words implied racial bias, Marcus said, his professional mask still in place, but his tone firm. That is not how we do things at Pacific Sky Airlines. Vanessa nodded but didn't back down. Good. But an apology isn't enough. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. Marcus sighed. I understand. We'll schedule a meeting to discuss further steps. Vanessa took one last look at Linda before finally stepping toward the jet bridge. Marcus Reynolds adjusted his tie, clearly aware that all eyes were on him. He had been called in to handle a minor security issue, but now he found himself at the center of a public relations nightmare. Miss Garter, he began carefully, his voice measured. I understand that this situation was regrettable. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Regrettable, she repeated, her tone laced with controlled frustration. I was accused of fraud, publicly humiliated, and delayed from boarding, despite having a fully valid first-class ticket. And now that you know who I am, suddenly it's regrettable. Linda Kessler, still standing stiffly by the podium, scoffed under her breath. It wasn't personal, she muttered. I was just doing my job. Colonel Redding let out a low chuckle, stepping closer. Your job. I'd love to see the section of your training manual that says, call security when a black woman hands you a first-class ticket. His voice was calm, but the weight behind his words made the entire gate area dead silent. Officer Craig Mitchell, still holding Vanessa's ID, exhaled and looked at Linda, then at Marcus. She's right, he admitted, voice low. This was handled wrong from the start. I should have shut it down earlier. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. Miss Kessler, he said slowly, you are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full review. Linda's eyes widened. What? I was just... This airline has zero tolerance for discrimination, Marcus said firmly. And right now, I have to make sure we prove that's not just a corporate slogan. Vanessa didn't react to Linda's shock. Her focus was on the bigger picture. Suspending one employee won't fix the culture that led to this, she said. We need systemic changes. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Oh, we'll talk. But for now, Miss Carter, please, allow me to personally escort you to your seat. Vanessa held his gaze for a moment, then finally stepped toward the jet bridge. Vanessa Carter's experience is not just a dramatic story. It reflects real-life biases that many people face daily. This incident at the airport is a reminder that racial profiling, unconscious bias, and systemic discrimination still exist, even in places where professionalism should be the standard. So, what can we take away from this? Awareness and accountability. Whether we are employees, customers, or bystanders, we must recognize when bias is at play. Linda Kessler didn't question her own actions, but others, like the security officer, eventually realized their mistake. We should challenge our assumptions before acting on stereotypes. The power of speaking up. Colonel Redding's intervention changed the situation. Had he stayed silent, Vanessa may have been dismissed or further humiliated. This shows the importance of allies. When you see discrimination, don't ignore it. Systemic change matters. One employee's suspension won't fix a broken system. Organizations must train staff properly, enforce fair policies, and hold people accountable. True change starts from within. Ultimately, Vanessa's story teaches us that dignity and fairness should not depend on race, gender, or status. It's up to all of us to ensure that bias does not dictate opportunity or respect. If you were in Vanessa's position, what would you do? Would you stand your ground and demand justice? 1. Ensuring that the issue is addressed, so no one else has to go through the same experience? Or would you avoid confrontation and move on too, choosing to prioritize your personal peace and avoid further conflict? Let me know by commenting 1 or 2 below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Your engagement helps bring more stories like this to light.